In the autumn of 1883, in the sage-flattened Badlands east of Boise City in the Idaho Territory, a woman named Cora Vane walked into Halsey's Dry Goods and Assay with a gold ring in her palm and a need she could not fully name. She was 27 years old. She had been a wife for 4 of those years and a widow for 6 weeks, and she had nothing left from the marriage worth keeping except the ring itself, which she did not intend to keep. The store smelled of pine pitch and leather and something faintly chemical from the assay corner, where a scale sat beneath a green glass lamp. She set the ring on the counter without hesitation. Old Halsey looked at it. He was a man who had weighed 1,000 things in his 60 years and knew the weight of a decision made before a woman walked through a door. He did not ask her if she was certain. What he offered in return was a leather journal, cracked along the spine, water-stained at the bottom third, the name Purvis Dodd lettered in faded ink on the inside cover. "A prospector," he said. "Came in from the Owyhee country 3 springs ago with a cough he could not rid himself of. Left the journal as surety on a mule and a week's provisions. Never came back for either." Cora turned the journal in her hands. The cover was the color of old tobacco. The pages, where they fanned, showed dense penciled handwriting, broken at intervals by rough sketches, columns of figures, and what appeared to be partial maps drawn in a careful but unpracticed hand. Halsey said the journal was worth less than the ring by any measure a reasonable person might apply. Cora said she was no longer a reasonable person by that measure, folded the journal under her arm, and walked out into the October wind. If you have ever held a thing that other people have dismissed and felt the weight of it shift in your hands as you turned it over, stay with this story. It does not end where most people would expect. The wagon she lived out of stood at the edge of town. She had her father's surveying tools in a canvas roll under the seat, a collapsible transit she had learned to operate before she was 14, a set of brass and glass measuring instruments her father had carried from Ohio to the territories and left to her when his lungs gave out in the winter of 1878. The tools were the only thing her husband had not been able to sell. He had tried. He had called them useless and women's nonsense in the same breath, which told her he had not tried very hard to understand either category. She lit the lantern and opened the journal to the first page. Purvis Dodd had been a prospector of the old-fashioned variety, which is to say he was more observer than digger, a man who spent his days reading the land rather than tearing it apart. He wrote the way a man writes when he believes no one will ever read what he sets down, which is honestly and without ornament. He had been working the drainages east of the Owyhee Plateau for 6 years when the journal began. He knew the country the way a trapper knows a river, which is to say bone deep and with a quality of attention that never became habit. The first 30 pages were survey notes, essentially, written in a prospector's shorthand of compass bearings, elevation estimates, drainage directions, and the color of exposed rock at various elevations. Cora could read them easily. Her father had taught her that a landscape tells its history in layers, that the land does not lie even when the men who claim to own it do, and that a person with the patience to read the evidence carefully will always know more than a person who is simply loud about what they believe. By the second night, she had reached the middle section of the journal, and Purvis Dodd's handwriting had changed. It was still careful, but had acquired a compressed quality. Letters tighter, the pencil pressed harder into the page. He had found something. He was being deliberate about not naming it directly, which was either habit or caution, and she thought it was caution. What she could piece together was this. In the spring of 1880, working a dry drainage about 18 miles northeast of a way station called Cutter's Crossing, Dodd had found evidence of a placer deposit of unusual character. Not gold dust or flake, which was what most men were after, but a deeper indicator, a specific arrangement of mineral staining on exposed bedrock that his years of reading the Owyhee country had taught him to recognize as the surface signature of something below. He hadn't been able to get to the bedrock itself. The drainage was crossed by a fence line, and the land on the far side of the fence had been claimed, legally recorded at the Territorial Land Office, by a concern called the Meridian Grazing and Land Company out of Portland. He had written the company name in large letters and then, below it, a single sentence. They do not know what they are sitting on top of. Cora set the journal down and looked at the lantern flame. She had heard of the Meridian Company. Anyone who moved through the territory had heard of the Meridian Company. It was the sort of concern that called itself a grazing operation and held 40,000 acres under that designation, while doing very little actual grazing. The man whose name appeared on the company's territorial registration was a lawyer from Portland named Aldous Crane, who had never, to anyone's knowledge, set foot on the land he controlled and who was understood to manage it from a distance through a series of leases and liens and quietly purchased county assessments that kept the taxes low and the title clear, and the land effectively sealed against outside examination. She had also heard, some months earlier, in a dry goods conversation she had not been meant to overhear, that the Meridian Company's claim on that particular drainage had been contested 6 years ago by a Basque sheep herder named Elorza, who had grazed the land for 2 decades under an informal arrangement with the territorial government before the company's title arrived and the arrangement was canceled. Elorza had filed a counterclaim at the land office. The counterclaim had been dismissed. The sheep herder was, as of the conversation she had overheard, living on a narrow strip of leased land north of Cutter's Crossing, with his daughter and her children still running a small flock, no longer young. She did not sleep well that night. The surveying tools had been her father's in the way that a compass is a navigator's, not merely an instrument, but an extension of a way of thinking. He had spent 2 decades making territorial surveys for the government, work that was technically imprecise by the standards he aspired to, but that gave him an education in the relationship between what a map claimed and what the land actually contained. He had passed this education to Cora in the only form available to him, which was alongside the technical instruction in transit operation and compass correction and grade calculation. She could run a survey line. She could read a legal plat and find where the measurements did not agree with the ground. 3 days after she traded the ring, she drove the wagon northeast out of Boise City. The road to Cutter's Crossing was a track, really, packed sage earth with a single rut of wheel passage down its center. The Owyhee country in October was the color of old straw, the hills rolling and bare, the sky enormous and pale blue with the cold coming down from the north. She passed 2 homesteads in the first 8 miles and no other habitation for the remaining 12. The way station at Cutter's Crossing was a low log building with a sod roof and a corral, operated by a man named Pratt, who rented overnight space to travelers and sold grain and cured meat at prices that reflected his monopoly on the road. She asked about Elorza. Pratt took his time answering. He said the old Basque was a stubborn man who grazed 200 sheep on land that barely supported 50 and who had an opinion about the Meridian Company that he had never learned to keep private. She asked where to find him. Pratt pointed north. The Elorza holding was a 1/4 mile of good stream frontage and 400 acres of rocky hillside, which was not enough land for what the old man needed, but was what remained after the company's claim had taken the drainage and the flat ground beside it. His daughter, a woman named Mirren, met Cora at the gate of the small yard in front of the stone house. She was perhaps 40, dark-eyed and direct, and she looked at the wagon and the canvas-rolled tools under the seat without comment before she looked at Cora's face. Cora said she had a question about the drainage the Meridian Company controlled. Myron said the family had answered that question in every legal venue available to them and had no energy left for questions that led nowhere. Cora said she was not a lawyer. Myron studied her for a moment and then opened the gate. The old man, Elorza, sat in the main room near a small iron stove, wrapped in a blanket despite the relative mildness of the October afternoon. He was past 70, his face deeply lined, his hands still thick and capable-looking even in rest. He spoke careful English with the particular precision of a man who has learned it as a working tool and never stopped being deliberate with it. Cora showed him the journal. She showed him the pages where Purvis Dodd had described the drainage, the mineral staining, the fence line, the company name. She showed him the survey notes in the journal's first section that established the drainage's position relative to landmarks she had already matched to her father's territorial atlas. Elorza looked at the pages without touching them. Then he looked at Cora. He said the land had been in the family's use for 23 years before the company's paper arrived. He said the original informal arrangement with the territorial government had been made in writing with a land office clerk named Dowd, who had retired to Oregon 3 years before the counterclaim was filed and was therefore not available to confirm what he had written. He said the counterclaim had been dismissed because the Meridian Company's territorial registration was in order and the family's arrangement was informal, and the clerk who could confirm it was gone. Cora said she understood. She said she had a different question. She asked whether the original 23 years of use had ever been formally surveyed. Elorza said no formal survey had been made. The territorial government's informal arrangement had been based on a handwritten letter of use assignment from the clerk Dowd and on the family's continued occupation of the land, neither of which constituted a surveyed claim. Cora said she would like to see the letter. Myron brought it from a wooden box in the back room. It was a single sheet of government letter-headed paper, dated March of 1857, signed by T.W. Dowd, Land Office Clerk, Idaho Territory, assigning use rights to the drainage and adjacent grazing land to one Felipe Elorza and his heirs in recognition of prior occupation and improvement. The letter used specific language. It described the drainage's origin point as the confluence of two named creeks and its western boundary as a line drawn from that confluence at a bearing of 214 degrees magnetic for a distance of 2 miles. Cora read the bearing and the distance twice. She said she would need 3 days. If you have ever suspected that the official version of a thing and the actual geography of that thing do not agree, you will understand what she suspected. She did not say this aloud. She set the journal on the table next to the letter and began to write. She ran the survey line on the second day, in the early morning when the light came from the east and made the shadow lines in the terrain legible. Her father's transit was a heavy instrument, brass-bodied with a worn leather carrying case, and she had not used it in 8 months, but the muscle memory for leveling the bubble and reading the vernier scale returned without effort, the way a learned thing returns when it is genuinely needed. She set her starting stake at the confluence of the 2 creeks described in the letter, a point that was unambiguous because the creeks had names, and the names appeared on the territorial atlas, and the confluence was where the atlas showed it to be. She ran the bearing. 214 degrees magnetic, corrected for the local declination her father's field notes established at 14 degrees east for this part of the territory. She chained the distance in stages, driving stakes every 100 yards, reading back over her shoulder each time to confirm the line was true. The Oahe country was not flat country, and a surveyed line through rolling sage terrain required care. She took the care. She did not rush the distance math. When she had chained 2 miles, she drove a final stake and stood up from her knees and looked at where she was standing. She was standing 12 yards inside the Meridian Company's fence line. The fence line was not where the Meridian Company's territorial registration said it was. She spent the afternoon running verification checks, running the line a second time from a different starting method, checking her compass correction against the shadow position of the sun at noon. The numbers did not change. The company's fence enclosed land that the letters bearing and distance placed outside the Meridian Company's registered boundary. The drainage and the mineral ground Purvis Dodd had described was not inside the company's legal claim. The fence had been built to say it was. She went back to the Elorza house at dusk. She set her survey notes and the field calculations on the table beside the letter and the journal. Elorza and Myron sat across from her. She explained what the letters bearing and distance described, what the registered boundary claimed, and what her survey established about the difference. She used plain terms. She did not use the word fraud, because the word was not hers to use, but the numbers said what they said, and both Elorzas were capable of reading numbers. Elorza looked at the survey notes for a long time. Then he said the name Aldous Crane, with a flatness in his voice that was not anger but its older and quieter cousin. Cora said the field notes and calculations, together with the original letter, would constitute the basis for a new counterclaim at the Territorial Land Office, one that now had a surveyed foundation rather than an informal one. She said she knew a territorial surveyor in Boise City who had worked with her father and whose certification would carry more weight than her own unsigned field notes. She said she would write to him that evening. She also said that Purvis Dodd's journal, which contained the earliest documented description of the drainage's mineral character and which predated any company survey of the property, should accompany the filing as evidence that the land's value was known to a disinterested observer before the fence line was placed where it was placed. Myron looked at the journal. She asked where Cora had gotten it. Cora said she had bought it. Myron asked what she had paid. Cora said something she no longer needed. The letter went to the certified surveyor, a man named Greer, who had worked alongside Cora's father on 2 government contracts in the 1870s, and who remembered the elder Vane with the kind of professional respect that transfers partly to a person's surviving kin. Greer rode out to the drainage in the 3rd week of October and ran his own survey line, which agreed with Cora's within 6 yards across the 2-mile distance, a correspondence that was close enough to constitute corroboration and far enough apart to confirm they had worked independently. His signed and certified notes went to the Territorial Land Office in Boise City on the 1st of November, accompanied by the original Dowd letter, Cora's field calculations, and Dodd's journal, which the Land Office agreed to hold as supporting documentation. The Meridian Company's land agent in Boise City received the filing notice the following week. He sent a letter to Portland. The response from Aldous Crane took 11 days to arrive, which was longer than usual, and when it came, it did not contest the survey measurements directly. It questioned the validity of the original letter's use assignment on administrative grounds, arguing that T.W. Dowd had lacked the authority to issue use rights in the form the letter described. The Territorial Land Commissioner, who had been in his position for 3 years and had a quiet but well-documented dislike of large paper-holding concerns that called themselves grazing operations without doing much grazing, pulled the original record of Dowd's appointment and authority from the office's own files. Dowd's commission had specifically included the authority to issue informal use assignments for land not yet surveyed and claimed. The administrative grounds collapsed. The revised counterclaim was granted in December. There was no ceremony. There was no confrontation. Aldous Crane did not ride out from Portland, and his fence did not come down all at once, but section by section over the following spring as the company's land agent quietly redrew the operation's boundaries to reflect what the land office now said they were. The mineral ground Dodd had described became, in the formal sense, accessible to examination. What lay below it was a matter for the next season's work, and the next woman or man patient enough to ask the right questions. Elorza did not live to see the full spring. He died in February in the stone house with his daughter beside him. He had seen the land office's decision before he died, which was enough. Mirren told Cora this in a letter that arrived in March, written on plain paper in careful and economical English. Cora read the letter at her wagon's tailgate in the afternoon light. She had wintered near Boise City, taking small surveying work where she could find it, and had enough set aside to move on in the spring if she chose to. The wagon was the same one. The canvas roll of tools was under the seat. The journal she kept. She had written to the Territorial Land Office asking what became of Purvis Dodd's effects after his counterclaim was resolved, and the Land Office had written back that there were no effects on record other than the journal, which had been submitted as evidence and which the office, upon the counterclaim's resolution, had no further use for, and was content to return to the party who had submitted it. She set it on the seat beside her. It was a cold morning, and she had the red shawl around her shoulders, the one her mother had knitted in the winter before she died, and which Cora had kept through everything because it was the one thing in the marriage she had known her husband would not be able to sell, it being a woman's thing and therefore beneath his notice. She picked up the journal and opened it to the last page Purvis Dodd had written on, the page where his handwriting ran out, and she looked at the last line he had set down. He had written that the land does not change its mind about what it holds. Only the men above it do. She had read the line many times. It seemed to her a true thing, stated by a man who had understood the ground beneath him and had not had the tools or the time to say so in a way anyone else could verify. She had had the tools. She had had the time. The ground had said what it held. She closed the journal. She picked up the reins. The morning was bright and cold, the sage hills silver with frost, the sky above the Owyhee country, the particular shade of blue that only comes in early spring, when the cold is still in the air. But the light has already changed. She didn't look back at Boise City as she drove out of it. She had never been a person who looked back at the things she had left behind. The ring had been the last of that. Ahead of her, the road ran northeast, toward country she had not yet surveyed, toward ground that had not yet been asked the right questions. She drove into it at the pace the country required, which was unhurried and deliberate, and in its own plain fashion, entirely sufficient. If a woman's careful work has ever corrected something that powerful people called settled, leave a word about it below. There is another story waiting, one as quiet and as unignorable as this one. This story is a work of historical fiction. The characters, companies, land disputes, and events depicted are invented. Any resemblance to actual persons or historical proceedings is coincidental. The work Greer did on the survey was methodical in the way that all good survey work is methodical, which is to say it was repetitive and physical and cold. October in the Owyhee country does not invite lingering. He had brought a chainman, a young Nez Perce man named Sam, who had worked with Greer for 2 seasons and who understood survey chains the way the older man understood transit levels, which is to say, without thinking about it, the body performing what the mind has long since absorbed. They worked from Cora's stakes, which Greer had asked to find in the ground before he set his own, and which he found exactly where her field notes placed them, a fact he noted in his own record without emphasis, but with a precision that amounted to the same thing. What Cora had done in 3 days alone, Greer and Sam accomplished in 2, and Greer's certification carried a weight that her unsigned field work could not because her work was less accurate, but because the land office required a registered signature, and registered signatures had to be earned in a specific institutional way that she had not had the time or the means to pursue. Her father had held a certificate. She did not. This was a fact she had absorbed without complaint, it being one of the more ordinary of the territory's ordinary injustices. She had been present when Greer ran his line. She had stood at a distance and watched the chainman move through the sage with the 66-foot chain and watched Greer sight through the transit and call adjustments, and she had felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone else confirm what she had already established, which is a satisfaction unlike the satisfaction of discovery itself, but is in some ways more durable because it means the thing you found is real in the way that other careful people can verify. Greer had said nothing to her directly about the fence line until the second day, when the last stake was driven and the numbers were in his field book, and there was no longer any question about what they showed. He had stood at the final stake and looked at the company's fence line 12 yards to the east of where they were standing, and said in his flat survey man's voice that someone had been careless with their boundary, which was how a careful man described fraud when he wanted to be understood without using the word. Cora had said the original letter's bearing was clear. Greer had said it was. He had said he had known her father to run a line with that kind of specificity in 1876 on the Snake River country, and that he had no difficulty recognizing the same standard in the letter Dowd had written. He said a bearing of 214 degrees was not a bearing that resulted from imprecision. Someone had known exactly what they were describing, and someone else had known exactly what that description excluded from their fence. He said this once, put his field book in his coat, and did not say it again. Sam had gathered the transit and the chain without comment. He had looked at the fence line once, in the way that a person looks at a thing that has been in the wrong place for a long time and is now known to be there. The filing of Greer's certified survey notes at the Territorial Land Office was not a dramatic event. It was a paper transaction, carried out across a counter in a low building near the center of Boise City by a clerk who received documents all day and noted them in a register and filed them in labeled wooden trays. Cora brought the packet herself and watched it received and noted. The clerk gave her a receipt with a case number on it. She folded the receipt and put it in the journal in the back, behind the last of Dodd's writing. She had developed, in the weeks since she had traded the ring, a habit of reading the journal in the evenings that she had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. It was not that she found new information in it after the first thorough reading. It was that Dodd's way of writing about the land had the quality of certain kinds of company, the kind that does not require conversation and does not diminish with repetition. He wrote about the Owehee country the way her father had talked about the Snake River Basin, with a precision of observation that came from attention sustained over years, and reading it was like spending an evening with someone who had looked at the same things she had looked at, and had found them as endlessly legible and as patient as she did. She had wondered about him. She had asked after him at the way station and at a homestead east of Cutter's Crossing, and what she assembled from these inquiries was sparse. He had been a man of perhaps 50 when he had last been seen, spare and deliberate in his speech, who had worked the Owehee drainages for 6 years without a partner or a lasting camp, traveling light and coming into the settlements only for provisions. The cough that Halsey had mentioned had been remarked on by others as well, which placed its beginning at least a year before Dodd had stopped traveling the road. Whether he had died somewhere in the country he had spent his years reading, or had made it back to some origin that no one in the Idaho Territory knew to name, no one she asked could say. She thought he would have been content with the drainage being set right. She thought this without sentimentality, in the same way she thought about her father's instruments as his legacy, not as a romantic idea, but as a practical continuation of a way of paying attention to the world. The land office case proceeded through the winter in the methodical way that territorial land cases proceed, which is to say through correspondence and referral and a series of administrative decisions, each of which was less dramatic than the one before it, and collectively added up to the reversal of something that had been wrong for 6 years. The Meridian Company's legal response arrived in stages, each stage more compressed than the last, as though Aldous Crane in Portland was watching the available ground for argument shrink and was adjusting accordingly. Cora did not correspond directly with the company's legal agent. She had nothing to say to him that the land office's case record did not already say more effectively. She was, during this period, doing other work. She had taken a small contract from a homesteader northwest of Boise City who needed a property line run against a neighbor's disputed fence, and a second contract from a woman who operated a boarding house and needed a survey of her lot confirmed against the city plat before she could sell. Both jobs were modest and paid modestly, but they required the transit and the chain and her father's correction tables, and she was glad of the physical work and of the precision it required. The boarding house woman, whose name was Addie, had asked about the tools while Cora was packing them away after the lot survey. She had asked whether it was usual for a woman to carry survey instruments, and Cora had said she did not know what was usual, only that the instruments had been her father's, and that she had been learning them since she was old enough to manage the tripod. Addie had said this seemed practical to her. It did seem practical, Cora said. Addie had made coffee and they had drunk it on the back steps of the boarding house while the afternoon light moved across the city plat diagram Cora had drawn, and it had been a pleasant hour in the ordinary way that hours can be pleasant without any particular significance attaching to them. These were the hours that constituted most of a life, she thought. The intervals between the large and legible events, the mornings running a chain through frost-silvered sage, the evenings with a journal and a lantern, the coffee on a boarding house step. They were not dramatic, but they were not nothing. She had been told in various ways and by various people over the course of her life that the intervals did not count, that what counted was the arrival at a named destination. She had come to believe this was incorrect. The Alorza holding, when she returned to it in late January to deliver a copy of the case record to Myron, had the stripped-down look of winter on the high range, the hills gray-brown and close, the creek running low and clear between ice-shelved banks. Myron met her at the gate and led her inside without ceremony. The old man was in his chair, thinner than in October but alert, and he looked at the case record papers with the careful attention of someone who has learned to distrust documents, but who has also learned to read the ones that say what he has been waiting to hear. He said, after a time, that he had grazed this drainage for 23 years, and the company's paper had told him for 6 of them that he had been wrong to do so. Cora said the record now showed differently. He said he knew that, and what he wanted to know was whether it would hold. She said she believed it would. She said that Greer's certification was solid, and the land office's process had been thorough, and the company's administrative argument had not found any footing worth noting. She said that what the land held below the surface was a separate question and one that would unfold on its own terms, but that the use right for the drainage and the grazing land was, in her understanding, as settled as a territorial counterclaim could be. He looked at her with the particular directness of old men who have learned that directness saves time. He said she had done this work at her own expense. She said the journal was payment enough. He looked at the journal under her arm, which she had brought out of habit, and said Purvis Dodd had been through the country twice in the years the family had grazed the drainage and had seemed a careful and observant man. She said that was an accurate description. He said it seemed to him that 2 careful and observant people had between them accomplished what his own careful observations had not been able to accomplish alone, which was to make the ground say what it had always known. He said this as a statement of practical fact and not as a compliment, and she received it in the same register. She stayed that night and drove back to Boise City in the morning. The road was frozen and the wheels rang on the hard earth, and the sage hills were white with the overnight frost going silver in the early light. The journal was on the seat beside her, as it usually was, She had written in the back of it, in the space after Dodd's last entry, a summary of the survey work she had done and the case record that had resulted. She had not signed it. It seemed to her that the journal was a working document, and that working documents should contain the work, and that the work was its own signature. She had thought once about whether she should send the journal to some archive or records repository where Dodd's observations of the Oahe country would be available to other people who might find them useful. She had decided against this, not because the idea was wrong, but because the journal was not finished. There was still country in the Oahe Basin that had not been asked the right questions, and the journal's habit of asking them carefully seemed to her a resource that ought to remain in the hands of someone prepared to continue the inquiry. The frost burned off before she reached the city. The hills went back to the color of old straw. The sky above the Oahe country was the pale, enormous blue of January, and the road ahead of her ran straight and clear through the sage, and she drove into it at the pace the country required. The boarding house survey led to a second contract and then a third, and by the time February was fully cold and the work of the land office case had settled into the bureaucratic patience of waiting, she had a small reputation in Boise City as a woman who ran a clean line and did not inflate her measurements or her invoice. This reputation was worth more to her in practical terms than any of the other small dignities she had accumulated over the course of the winter, because it meant the work came to her without her having to seek it, and seeking work was the more difficult of the two. She did not think of herself as building a profession. She thought of herself as continuing her father's work in the form available to her, which was a more accurate description of what she was doing and also a less pressured one. Her father had been a man who believed that a survey line run honestly was a contribution to the general legibility of the world, and that the world was in want of legibility more urgently than it was in want of most other things men spent their time providing. She had absorbed this belief so early and so thoroughly that she no longer thought of it as a belief, but simply as a fact of the same order as the level of a bubble in a transit tube, either centered or not, and the difference matters. The transit was the instrument that her father had trusted most. The brass and glass body of it was scratched in several places from years of field use, and one of the adjustment screws had a tendency to loosen in cold weather that required checking before any serious work was begun. She had learned to check it as naturally as she checked the horizon for weather before starting a long line. These small habits of attention were the inheritance that no one had tried to sell, and she carried them the way she carried the shawl, against her skin where they were always warm. On the morning of the third week of February, she received a letter from the Territorial Land Office. It was addressed to her by name, and the return address was the commissioner's office rather than the general filing desk, which was unusual. She opened it standing at the wagon's tailgate in the thin morning light. The commissioner wrote briefly. The Meridian Company had withdrawn its administrative objection. The revised counterclaim was confirmed. The use rights to the drainage and the adjacent grazing land were restored to the Alorza family standing per the original 1857 assignment. The commissioner added, in a final sentence that departed slightly from the formal register of the rest of the letter, that the quality of the surveying work submitted in support of the counterclaim had been noted. She read that sentence twice. It was not a large thing. It was the institutional equivalent of what Greer had said, standing at the final stake in the Oahe sage, restrained and specific and not repeated, and she received it in the same way she received all precisely aimed things, without performance, with attention, and with a quiet that was not the absence of feeling, but its particular form. She wrote to Myron that afternoon. She used the same plain English register that Mirren had used in her own letters, which was the appropriate register for correspondence between people who did not know each other well enough for ceremony and respected each other enough to dispense with it. She stated the case outcome clearly and included the date of the commissioner's letter. She said she hoped the spring grazing would be easier for the restoration of the full drainage. She did not express hope for the family's loss of the old man because Myron had not asked her to, and because the loss was present in everything Myron wrote without requiring acknowledgement to make it real. The reply came in March, the letter she had read at the wagon's tailgate in the afternoon light. It said what it said plainly. She folded it and put it in the journal behind the land office receipt, and the journal held it the way it held everything, without comment and without loss. Greer had told her in January that if she wanted to sit for the certification examination for territorial surveyors, he would put her name before the examining board. He had said this once, the way he said most things, without elaboration or coaxing, and she had said she would think about it. She had thought about it through the winter, and in March, she wrote to him and said she would sit for the examination in the spring session if he was still willing to put her name forward. He wrote back 2 weeks later and said the session was the last week of April, and her name was registered. The examination was conducted in a room above the land office by 3 men who had each been in the territory for at least 15 years and who had between them surveyed more of it than any other 3 people she was likely to meet. 2 of them asked her the questions that were on the written portion of the examination, with the neutral efficiency of men doing a thing they had done before. The third, an older man named Haas, whose hands were covered in the weather marks of a life spent outdoors, watched her work through the field calculation problems with an attention she recognized as the same attention she had given to the journal's survey pages in the first days after the trade. The attention of a person reading a thing for what it actually contains, rather than for what they expect to find. She passed the examination. The certificate was issued in the commissioner's office on the last day of April, bearing her name in the formal type of the territorial seal and the examining board's 3 signatures below it. She held it for a moment and then rolled it and put it in the canvas tool roll, alongside the transit and the correction tables and the chain lengths, where it would not bend. She was not certain after April whether she would stay in Boise City or move to another part of the territory where the work might take a different shape. The wagon could go where the work was, which was one of the things the wagon had always been good for. The tools would go where the wagon went, and the journal with them. She knew the Owyhee country better than she had known it in October, and she knew it in a different way than she had learned it from Dodd's pages, which was through the body rather than through the mind, through the chain distances and the transit sightings and the cold of the ground under her knees when she was driving stakes. The country had not changed its mind about what it held. She had only given it the instruments to say so. The journal stayed with her. She did not put a second name on it, because the work recorded in its back pages was not separate from Dodd's work in the front pages, but a continuation of it, and the journal did not need a second name any more than the drainage needed a second fence. The land knew its own boundaries. The work had made them legible. That was enough. There was a morning in late April, before the examination, when she had driven out of the city to run a property line on a homestead grant east of the river, and had stopped at the top of a low rise to check the transit level before setting up. The morning was clear and cold, the sky the pale blue of early spring, the sage hills stretching east toward the Owyhee country, and beyond it the faint line of the mountains against the far horizon. She stood on the rise with the transit on its tripod, and the journal in her coat pocket, and the shawl around her shoulders, and looked at the country for a moment before the work of the day required her full attention. The horizon was a long level line, unbroken. The land under it was legible to someone who knew how to read it. She had that knowledge and the instruments to make it precise, and the patience to use both carefully, and that was not nothing. She leveled the bubble and began.